young lad approaches the town rabbi. And he says, "Rabbi, I have a question." He said, "Yes, certainly, my son. Remember this? What can I do for you?" And he says, "Is there an appropriate blessing that we say for the czar?"
Yeah.
And the rabbi says, "A blessing for the czar? Yes, of course we do." You say, "May God bless and keep the czar far away from us." We all remember. In fact, there is actually a blessing that the Torah has, or that the Jewish life has, that we would recite upon seeing a czar or a monarch. Jewish law mandates brachas, blessings, for all kinds of things in life. Events, experiences, both religious events and mundane events. And this is, of course, the meaning, and this is what this idea was in Fiddler on the Roof. But as we begin tonight on page 70, let's take a look. Let's consider three well-known brachas that we recite upon specific religious behaviors. Let's take a look at three brachas. This is page 70, figure 3.1. So first we have, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, sanctified us and commanded us to kindle the light of the holy Shabbat." Right? Women before Shabbos, particularly women, sometimes men, they make this bracha before the lighting of Shabbos candles. The second one, "Blessed are you who has sanctified us and commanded us to kindle the Hanukkah lights." That one we're all familiar with. And finally, before we make Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, before that we say, "Asher Kiddushanu," who sanctified us and commanded us concerning the washing of the hands. So, these blessings, the common theme of them, of course, is the first part of the blessing, where we say, "Blessed are you who commanded us and sanctified us with his commandment." And the question is, lighting Shabbos candles, Hanukkah candles, washing hands, if you look at these three blessings, is there anything that comes to mind, or that a question that needs to be asked here? Yes? Okay. So Hanukkah is an event that occurred 1,500 years after the Torah was given, approximately, or so, 1,300 years. Certainly, the Torah does not have a commandment to light Hanukkah candles. For that matter, the Torah does not have a commandment to light Shabbos candles. The Torah does not have a commandment to wash our hands for the Tilat Yadayim, for washing our hands, sure, before bread, before eating. None of these things exist in the Torah. Not only don't they exist in the written Torah, they don't exist in the received Torah that we described in our first lesson. They're not derived from anywhere in the Torah. And yet, somehow, we say that God commanded us to do these things. Now, for the great scholars in the house, not only is that problematic just in the honesty of the statement, it would seem, but in addition to that, we know we're actually very, very careful about not reciting a blessing using God's name in vain. So we say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God." We say Hashem's name, Hashem, Elokeinu, Melech HaOlam. And here we're saying an out untruth, it would seem. God never commanded us to do these things. And yet, these mitzvahs, and many other mitzvahs that we say, we make it, we just lay it out there. No child even thinks about this. I mean, we might learn this as little kids, but what does it mean that God commanded us to do all these things? So this question is asked in the Talmud, page 71. And this is the Gemara in Shabbos, and this is related to the Hanukkah lights. And as Nadine said, the Hanukkah lights is the one that strikes us the most. It gives us sort of definition to all of this, because Hanukkah happened so many years later. Shabbos is from the beginning of Judaism, but Hanukkah certainly is not. Okay, Nadine, why don't you read for us? Text 1.
The blessing is recited when people leave the Torah. One recites the blessing, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to keep the Hanukkah light." But where did he command us? Abia said in the verse, "You shall not light it."
Okay, so this is in the Talmud's usual cryptic shorthand language. Everybody got that? So Rav Avia says as follows. He says, well, first of all, in Talmudic, sort of, I guess to enter the Talmudic Academy, it was expected that you knew the whole written Torah by heart. So they would just quote a verse, and it was understood that everybody knows exactly what we're talking about and where it is. And in the Talmud, it doesn't come with any footnote that tells you where it is. It just quotes the two words, and as if you understand what it says. I mean, for those of you who read the Hebrew, Rav Avia Amar Milo Tasur. That's it, 2 words. And the Dvarim, where it shows the footnote, or where the citation that this is in Deuteronomy, doesn't exist in the Talmud. Doesn't exist in the Talmud. So the expectation was that when they were talking there in the academy, everybody knew the whole written Torah by heart. And so they say, well, of course, where's the commandment? The commandment is from you shall not divert. So what is the passage? Let's take a look at the passage that Rav Avia is referring to. Text 2. Go ahead, Jonathan. Now, by the way, this is taken from Deuteronomy, and it's describing the role of the Sanhedrin. It's describing the role of the court and of the legislative body. Okay? Go ahead.
If a matter eludes you in a case involving capital punishment, litigation, birth marks, a case where there is a dispute in your cities, then you shall set out and go up to the place that God your Lord shall choose. You shall come to the Levitical priest and to the judge who will be in those days, and you shall inquire, and they will teach you the words of judgment. Tell you the words of judgment. You shall do according to the words they tell you from the place the Lord will choose, and you shall observe to do according to all they instruct you. You shall do according to the law they instruct you, and according to the judgment they say to you. You shall not divert from the word they tell you, neither right nor left.
So, this passage, these passages, number of verses here, it commands the Jewish people to inquire about and comply with the legal rulings of the Sanhedrin. It talks about the Supreme Court here, because it talks about going up to the place that God will choose. This refers to the Temple Mount, the Lishkas HaGazis, where there was the sitting, sort of the Supreme Court. And in its prime, this court, the Sanhedrin, was made up of 71 members, the finest scholars, and they sat in a chamber that was adjacent to the Beis HaMikdash throughout all the years of the existence of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, let's break down this piece here into 2 sections, these 2 passages. The first 3 verses are construed as a more narrow obligation to seek out and to follow the rulings of the Sanhedrin in areas where there are matters that are either elusive or disputed. But what additional insight, what's the last verse telling us? It seems as if the last verse is simply repeating over what it said earlier. Okay? It says, I'm reading the 3rd verse. You shall do according to the word they tell you from the place the Lord will choose. You shall observe to do according to all they instruct you. Okay, good. I got it. You should do whatever they say. Now what does it say? Once again, repeated. You shall do according to the law that they instruct you and according to the judgment that they say to you. You shall not divert from the word that they tell you, neither right nor left. What's added in the final verse? Yes?
I think they're saying it's not subject to interpretation. You can't listen to other people commentating, saying, well, maybe in this case it's different. They're saying you just have to follow the rulings.
So why would we not know that you should do everything that they instruct you to do from the earlier verse? In other words, what's added in the 4th verse that was not covered in the first 3 verses? It seems like the entire verse is extra. Excuse me? Right or left? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So in the Hebrew, min hamishpat asher yomer lecha ta'aseh, the law that they tell you. So Rav Avia explains this verse and introduces a broad command, okay, to obey according to Rav Avia and according to the Talmud, and we'll soon see that this is codified in Rambam and later in the Code of Jewish Law. This is a broad command to obey new legislation of the Sanhedrin such, like the institution of Hanukkah, which was instituted by the Sanhedrin. And with this, the Talmud is trying to explain to us, how do we say that God commanded us to light the menorah? So what the Talmud is saying is, where did God command us? God commanded us in his constitution. In his written constitution, he says, when the Sanhedrin legislates new law, you shall follow it. So the constitution requires that when there is new legislation, that becomes law. How does Rambam describe this? If you take a look at page 73, text 3, it follows, therefore, that what we mean to say in the blessing, blessed are you who has sanctified us with his commandments, and commanded us to listen to those who commanded us to kindle the Hanukkah lights. So whenever we make a bracha on rabbinic legislation, we are falling back on the commandment in that written constitution which says that you must follow legislation of the court, of the Sanhedrin, it's actually not so much like a court, this is a legislative body, so more like a Congress. Everybody get that? The concept? Michael, you're shaking your head. You don't understand the concept or you don't agree with it?
Pardon me for saying that this passage of Deuteronomy was written in the 5th century, in the 6th century, and was not referring to the Sanhedrin, which did not arise until after the exile. The passage of Deuteronomy was written in regards to paying attention to the laws enacted by the priests, the Levitical priests to be exact, as it says here. It was not referring to the Sanhedrin, which didn't exist for another 100 years, at least, until the Second Temple period.
So, the Sanhedrin, in terms of calling it Sanhedrin, you are correct. The Sanhedrin is a Greek derivative name, but in terms of a body of judges and a legislative body of judges, it existed before. We know that Moshe had a Sanhedrin, Yoshua had a Sanhedrin. We talk about the elders in the time of Yoshua. So again, we can discuss the name Sanhedrin. The term Sanhedrin, you are correct. I will, painful as it is for me, I will concede that, but only that. So the name Sanhedrin, yes, is a much later name. The body, the legislative body, existed long before, and I will share with you tonight a number of legislated items all the way from Moshe that we still do till today. All of us do, including you, Michael. We do till today, all the way from Moshe, that are part of Jewish life that are completely legislated. Completely legislated. And the same thing for Joshua, and the same thing for others in between. King David and others who had a court, who had a Bezin, had a Sanhedrin, that body, that larger legislative body. And in terms of its authorship, when it was, we can discuss. I do want to, though, relate to one question that Michael does raise, and that is, why do we call it the Leviim, HaKohanim HaLeviim, for the great scholars in the house? It talks about the Levitical priests and the judges that will be in those days. So first of all, it includes all three of them. It speaks about the Levitical priests and the judges, number one. Number two, it is a preference that judges be judges who are just like the priests and the Levites, that they were completely devoted to the service in the temple. They did not have land. They were not landed people in the land of Israel. They were not given property or an estate like the rest of the tribes. The contention is that a judge should also be devoted, those in the Sanhedrin should be devoted completely to their legislative work. In addition, one should have, on a Bezin, you're supposed to have Kohanim and Leviim as well. But going back to the Rambam, we have here an entirely new form of oral Torah. So we've spoken about the written, we've spoken about the received, we've spoken about the derived. Tonight we're moving to the next phase, to the next two phases of oral Torah, and we'll spend the rest of the evening talking about these two phases, and after Shavuos, we'll talk about all of the problems that exist with this whole system, including arguments, differences of opinion. How do we reconcile all these things if we are to consider all of this Torah? But tonight, our goal is to finish the understanding of the basic structure, And then, after Shavuos, we'll get into many of those questions that we raised at the beginning of the first lesson. So, if we turn to our table on figure 3.2 on page 74, so we have the four categories so far. We have a fourth category. We have received. These are the God-given explanations for each of the commandments. We have the derived, those laws that we derive from the written Torah and the received oral Torah through the 13 principles that we discussed last week. And tonight we talk about legislated. These are new laws legislated by rabbinic sages, by the Sanhedrin. Now, when we get into legislated, each one of these stages makes us more, or makes many people more and more uncomfortable. And the problem, and the reason it makes us so uncomfortable is because, okay, let's say for a minute I believe that there was something received. Let's say I get the logic of derived. I understand that there's something there alluded to in the words, and there's logical ways to understand. I mean, if God says that it's an illicit relationship, one of the famous Kal v'chomers that I don't think we mentioned last week, a very, very famous one is when the Torah describes all of the illegal relationships. It says a person may not marry, be intimate with their granddaughter. Nowhere does it mention their daughter, for an example. And this is an obvious Kal v'chomer, that the Torah says if one cannot have a relationship with their granddaughter, surely not their daughter. So this is considered derived on one hand, and yet that derived law is biblical. It's like that Sudoku thing where it's clear that the intent, based on the 13 principles, that the intent is that this should be banned. But now we're moving into whole new territory. Now the Torah itself, its own contention is that human beings now made this law. Now we're really in murky water here. Now, how is this godly? Okay, fine, God said to make laws. Let's even concede that for a moment. How do I know they're right? How do I know they're godly? How do I know this was the intention? How do I know this is what's supposed to be? Maybe they just got it wrong. Maybe they had an overzealous group of rabbis who wanted to make everyone's life miserable, and they just, hey, I got the power of the pen, I'm just going to write new law into law, and what is anyone going to do with it? How do we know? In addition to that, there's a time lapse. Many of these, most of them in fact, the vast majority, are written many, many years ago, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. What does that have to do with us today? Not only that, we live, I would say particularly today, we live in a climate and an environment where there's a tremendous emphasis on individualism and self-determination. And we have really an abhorrence, if you will, to sort of blindly following anybody or anything. Part of that has to do with the fact that the more we found out about the way things really work in the halls of power, the more we know what people in, whether political, whether, in any of these areas, the more we know about them, the more transparency there is, the more uncomfortable we are with how they've reached the decisions that they've reached. And so, for the rest of our time tonight, I want to sort of pull back that veil and actually talk about how those decisions are reached. And I think that hopefully it will have the opposite effect. By us understanding what are the parameters, what are the criteria for reaching new legislation, and there are laws written about how it may be reached, and what is the criteria, I think it will help us understand, or perhaps wrap our head around, how this can still be considered Torah, both from a halachic, as well as a little bit, we'll talk about the philosophical perspective as well. Okay. So we're commanded to obey rabbinic legislation, okay? And this reflects itself in the blessings that we make over rabbinic commandments. As the Rambam says, really in essence what we're saying when we light Shabbos candles, we're saying, blessed are you, Lord our God, who commanded those to command us to light the Shabbos candles. Okay. So I'm going to an example of this for a moment, just the logical part of it. We'll try the process of rabbinic legislation on 3 different topics. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of background. So we're going to divide the room here into a couple courts, and I'm going to give each of you a description of some kind of issue that arose related to rabbinic legislation. And the job is to assess whether there may be an enactment that can resolve the either societal issue or rabbinic or religious issue that arose. Now, every enactment can have positive effects, it can have negative effects, so I want you to consider all of these things. So think of yourselves as the sages of a Sanhedrin, trying to legislate and to enact, and it's your responsibility to preserve religious, the social, the cultural, the physical well-being of Jewish society that you're dealing with, okay? So I'm just going to do it, I think I'll just do it by table, okay? We'll just do, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. We'll go around. You're going to have to join somebody else, Galina. You'll have to join a table. I don't want to give you a table of 1. Okay. So let's take the first case. So this is the 1st century of the Common Era. Okay? The time of the destruction of the temple, what we know commonly as the rise of Christianity. It's actually really quite a bit later, but anyway, that's for Michael. So the pirate activity on the Mediterranean is rampant. Okay? Actually, it could be today also. Not in the Mediterranean, but, Horn of Africa. In addition to the plunder of personal property, the pirates sell the passengers and seamen into slavery. Representatives of Jewish communities